connecting your local development environment to a remote RDS instance in the cloud. In my last video, I showed how to set up an Amazon AWS RDS instance and then connect to it using JetBrains Datagrip to access the database. In this video, I want to show using that remote RDS instance in an example ASP.NET app. I won't go over setup in detail, but I will quickly summarize. There's more than one way to do this. We could leverage Docker and run a local Microsoft SQL Server instance in a container, or instead use AWS to create an RDS instance. At the AWS portal, always check your region, create a RDS instance of Microsoft SQL Server, set the username and password, check your virtual private cloud, enable public access. In the VPC security group, add an inbound rule for MSSQL with source to enable your IP access. And finally, trust the certificate generated by Amazon AWS for SSL in Datagrip. So here's my RDS instance. We'll need these connection settings in just a minute, but first let's create an example ASP.NET project. I'm going to use JetBrains Writer, but you can also scaffold a project using .NET CLI tools. By default, .NET CLI comes with several templates, and you can install more from NuGet. Executing the command .NET new list shows you available templates installed in your system. Create a folder for your project, cd inside, and execute .NET new MVC auth individual to bootstrap the project. In Writer, we create a new solution, choose ASP.NET Core Web Application, and select Individual Authentication for auth. I'm using individual authentication as an easy way to provide database operations in this example. By default, this project is likely configured to use SQLite. To switch to Microsoft SQL Server, first we'll need to install that NuGet package. Manage NuGet packages and search for Microsoft Entity Framework Core, SQL Server, and add it to the project. You can also do this via the .NET command line tools with .NET add package, or directly edit the CS project file and add to the package reference item group. With that package installed, we can edit the program CS and change our application builder DB context options to use SQL Server. Next, we'll need to change the connection string in our app settings. Completely replace the existing SQLite settings with your data source. These are the endpoint and port under connectivity and security of your AWS RDS instance. Note they are combined using a comma instead of a colon when specifying your data source. Specify your schema for the initial catalog. I'm going to set up an example schema in just a minute here. Enter the user ID and password you use in your RDS setup. Ideally, we should incorporate Secrets Manager, but for clarity, I'm going to specify them here in this example. Set multiple active result sets to true, encrypt true, and finally trust server certificate to true, enabling an SSL connection to our RDS instance. Migrations in this project template were likely set up for SQLite, and we'll have some conflicting data types. We're going to completely replace the initial migration. We'll be executing .NET EF commands. If you haven't installed Entity Framework tools, install them quick by executing .NET tool install global .NET EF cd inside the project folder. These commands don't work at the solution level. They are executed at the same directory as the CS project. Remove the existing migration by executing .NET EF migrations remove. Delete the old migrations folder. Create a new initial migrations by executing .NET EF migrations add create identity schema. Then let's move the new migrations folder back where it was originally under data. Now before we run those migrations, let's make sure our database is set up. I'm going to use JetBrains Datagrip to manage and access the database, which I've already set up to connect to RDS in my last video. Right-click the server and create a new database. I'll call this example database. Right-click the newly created database and select New Schema. I'll call this Example Schema. With those created, we can run our database migrations. Go back to your terminal where your CS project is located and execute .NET EF database update. You should see Entity Frameworks logger showing SQL commands successfully executed. Let's check that out in the database. In Datagrip, you need to make sure your database properties include your schema. Right-click on the database and select Properties. Go to the Schemas tab. Select and enable your schema. Use the refresh button as needed to pull updates. Enable DBO from your schema. And now we see our tables. We can see our Entity Framework Migrations History table with successful run of our initial create identity schema. Let's see the solution actually work. Run the project, select the register link, and create a new account. This will create new records in our user table. Again, you should see info log level SQL commands successfully executed in the console. Login to test reading those records from the database. And here's our user record in the ASP.NET Users table.